we frame it often like we are treasure hunters. We're walking into a building with the conviction and the belief that no matter what the popular narrative is about this school or this neighborhood, there are students and teachers and administrators that are filling the hallways every day who've been fashioned in the image of God. It's not our job to give them value or to give them direction or purpose. It's our job to enhance and support and affirm the beauty that already exists.
Hey there, welcome to the Global Fringe, hosted by April Diaz. If you want to experience more of our complex, diverse world, lean into these stories. If you've ever found yourself on the fringe of culture, this is for you. Our hope is that in the next few minutes, you feel seen, emboldened, and compelled to more. Welcome in.
Friends, welcome back to the Global Fringe. I am so excited to be back here again. We are almost at the end of season 2, which feels bonkers. But I have just loved the conversations with friends and mentors and guides and voices from the fringe that are leading us into the future. And it's been really great to have a little bit of a focus this season on the process that I use when I coach folks, and like, how do we actually see transformation and change and growth and movement take place in our life, in our world? And so we've looked at how do you define where you are right now, be really clear about, the red dot of where you're at in this moment in time, and then discern what the design needs to look like to move you from where you are to where you want to be. And in this last few episodes, and in the last 2 episodes now, we're taking a look at how do you do the work once you've defined where you are, once you design a plan that will move you from here to there to get you to different results, etc. What does it look like to actually do the work? Pay attention to stumbling blocks, jump over hurdles, sit at times and wait and see what happens, and to be really faithful in doing the work so that you can get to a different end. And so this episode, I'm really, really grateful and very excited to have a newer friend, a friend that I've known about for a number of years and have followed, but met in real life fairly recently. And I just adore this guy. He is one of my favorite Puerto Ricans, which is saying a lot because I married one and I've married into a very dynamic Puerto Rican family. But Jeremy Del Rio, thank you for saying yes to being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight, and it's been fun for me to get to know you as well. And I look forward to building on that relationship.
1,000%. I mean, you live in New York City, so we live about as far as we possibly can from one another in the United States of America. But you are doing such incredible work and have been faithfully for decades in New York City. One of my favorite things about you that you told me as we were preparing for this podcast was in 1998, you did something pretty, maybe it didn't feel heroic to you in the moment, it just felt necessary. But you took on Mayor Rudy Giuliani in a public sector, in a public gathering. Tell us what that whole thing was about, because I feel like it's kind of a quintessential description of who you are and of the kind of leader that you are. What happened back then?
Wow, you're taking us way back to
20 years ago. We're old.
Yeah. So back in 1996, I was the 21-year-old failed youth pastor of our church. I'm a preacher's kid. My parents had started a church a few years earlier. And when I was 19, they asked me to start the youth group. They had actually asked me for 2 years, and I kept on saying no. But at 19, I finally said yes. And by 21, I was convinced that they made the wrong choice and that I should have trusted my better instinct and not taken on this role. But in that moment of really feeling like I was way in over my head, I shared what I was going through with a friend who challenged me to be as vulnerable with the kids in the youth group as I had been with him. Initially, I thought he was crazy. That was like feeding raw meat to sharks. Um, but after thinking about it for a day or so, I realized that I really didn't have much to lose. And so, long story short,
Wow.
the outcome of that conversation was that 13 young people between the ages of 14 and 21
Wow.
started a youth center in a housing project in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That conversation was the catalyst, and within 6 months, we had a fully furnished space, rent free, and 7 college students who paid to be our interns. And our
Oh my
co
gosh.
founders were all between the ages of 14 and 21 and had no
Mhm.
business starting anything. We had no money, no staff, no
Yeah.
equipment, no space, but God gave us this location. A year later, the housing authority decided that they wanted the space back. Unbeknownst to us at the time, they were in a litigation with the group that had invited us to use the space. So we got caught up in that disagreement, and so the city changed the locks and wouldn't let us back in. And so
Mhm.
that was our baptism in community organizing. Again, we had no idea how to do it, but just trusted our gut, asked a lot of questions of friends, and began bombarding the chairman of the housing authority and the deputy mayors and the mayor's office with phone calls and faxes and petitions. And one thing led to another, and I was sitting in front of Mayor Giuliani advocating on behalf of this group of kids, and ultimately we got our space back. And that space is really the birthplace of what I do now in about 150 public schools around the city.
I, when you said, first of all, that you failed at something, and then, this is like this ragtag group of teenagers and young people that had this crazy idea. Like the whole time, I'm just thinking, that's the beginning of a great story. Like that's exactly the kind of amazing, adventurous life that I imagine God wants all of us to write with him, like it's just amazing. And it's certainly set you on a trajectory for the last 20 years to be doing some pretty phenomenal work. So in 2011, you started an organization. You co-founded the Thrive Collective. You're the executive director now. You're also a lawyer, NYU grad, right?
Yes, NYU
Yeah.
undergrad and law school.
So you're a smarty pants, and taking all of that pastoral work, pastor's kid, law school into the work that you do as the executive director of the Thrive Collective. And I love how you describe it on your website, which is just super clear and helpful for people to go, I can wrap my mind around this and I can engage in this. You say that we're about creating hope and opportunity through arts and mentoring in public schools. And last year, just in 2018 alone, you served 100 schools, 53,000 students, and have 120 partners. What the heck, dude? That's remarkable.
Well, thank you.
I didn't really set you up for a question there, but I mean, tell us a little bit about the work that you and your team do at Thrive Collective.
Well, it grew out of that Rudy Giuliani story. Ironically, that
Mm-hmm.
particular space, right? We were in a housing project for 15 years. We operated after school and summer camp programs, and directly across the street was a public K through 8 school that was the primary feeder of kids into our programs. About 10 years into this crazy experiment, my younger brother said to me one day, Jeremy, I'm tired that when kids finish our program, so many of them can't get a good job. If the gospel is really good news
Yeah.
for the poor, then at a minimum, we should be able to help them find a decent job. And,
Yeah.
it was a very convicting, poignant kind of moment But then he continued with this insight. He said, they can't find good work because so many of them are terrible at math. And they're bad at math, not because they can't do it, but they think they don't like it. He said, if I could teach math in that school, fewer of our kids would hate it and more of them would get good enough at it to get a good job. That insight was the beginning of a real fundamental paradigm shift for us, where we began to wrestle with the idea that sometimes it's not enough to be a good neighbor that just coexists across the street and shares kids and, from time to time might be in the same space. Sometimes be loving well as a neighbor involves going across the street and seeing how we can serve inside the building. And so that insight that began the journey. Actually, that would have been the summer of 2005. He started the process at that point to become a certified math teacher, get a certification. The following year, he was hired. That summer of 2006, there was a second opening also in the math department. And so the missions director of our church, who had been teaching at a school in Brooklyn, transferred into the same school to teach math. Within 3 years, the school was an A-rated school, and the principal credited the math department with leading the turnaround. And
oh my gosh.
that was very much the beginning of what we do now at Thrive. In 2011, inspired by that story, we incorporated as 2020 Vision for Schools with the goal of facilitating similar partnerships with other public schools and other community organizations, churches, youth ministries, nonprofits, etc. By 2014, we were working in enough schools through our partners where we realized every school had two common requests. They were different in a million respects, but they shared the need to strengthen their music and art programs, and they needed help recruiting mentors for their most vulnerable kids. And so starting in 2014, based on all the years of experience with different programs, we began to bring art back to the public schools that needed arts and music teachers. And that's a little bit of how it's evolved. It is pretty overwhelming when you give all the numbers, but that's what happens when you say yes and you listen to a need and are responsive to the need. And so God has really blessed us, and we're honored to serve in the different ways that we do.
You just said so many really deeply profound yet simple leadership principles in what you just said. First, I think as you just wrapped it up, leadership begins with listening, and as an ongoing listening practice, and listening to the needs of your community and those that you want to serve is pretty critical if you're actually going to do important work, right? And then I love how you talked about this insight that your brother had, because that's part of defining where you're at, right? Is you see something. And one of the things my coach has said to me countless times is insight produces an illusion of transformation. Just because your brother saw that math was the area that needed to be changed, just knowing that doesn't do anything, right? You put together a plan to be able to then change the outcomes that all of these students had for not just a school year, but for a lifetime. And I think that's a really poignant moment that you are listening to the needs of your people, and you've got this insight as a result of that then moves you on a journey to do some work that has literally changed thousands and thousands and thousands of kids' lives over the last decade. I'm so curious about how it is that you guys now at this, the size that you are as an organization, the fundraising is a beast. The work that you do is so expansive and complex. How do you as the executive director, as the leader of this movement, how do you be mindful and discerning and faithful to what exactly is the work that you do? Because you could do a million things, but you have to be focused, right? You've got to be specific. So what's that process look like for you to be really mindful, to do the faithful work?
I'll answer that in two ways. First, with my faithful heart, and then with my pragmatic the job done.
There we go. They
So
go
the
together.
on the faithful side, um, one thing that came to me back when I was a youth pastor, early 2000s. We were doing some outreach work in the neighborhood, and then we had a group of kids that were staying at the church, and it was kind of a short-term missions experience in the neighborhood. And before we let them go out and actually do any work, we wanted them to walk the neighborhood, and specifically
Mm.
we wanted them to walk with eyes open and discern what God saw and heard and felt about the neighborhood, which sounds like a crazy idea, to unleash a group of teenagers and tell them to hear God about this. But the way that we framed it out, was referencing the Lord's Prayer, and specifically
Yeah.
when Jesus said to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." In that moment, we grappled as a group with the kids, like, what does that look like? What does it look like for the kingdom to be demonstrated on earth as it is in heaven? And the insight in that moment was the best evidence, or one of the best evidences of the kingdom on earth, is answered prayer. And people of all faith traditions, no faith tradition, in their own ways, people have prayers, cries of their heart, deep needs that they're desperate to see resolved. And my conviction, our conviction, was that while we humanly may not be aware of those, theologically, we believe God is listening and God hears that. And so we translated that verse, we kind of, remixed it in our own vernacular and said, God, help me be an answer to someone else's prayer today. Give me eyes to see and ears to hear what you see and hear, and the courage to respond. There's a saying, a scripture that says, faith without works is dead. It's not enough just to have the insight or the discernment. If that's where it stays, it's a dead kind of faith. At some point, you need the courage to respond to that insight and to do something with it. And so that prayer that we did as a prayer walk with a youth group that was staying at our church, 15 or 20 years ago, that very much for me personally has been a mantra. Every time I walk into a school building, that's the prayer I enter the building with. God, how can I be an answer to someone else's prayer today in this building? I have conviction that there are grandparents praying for grandkids all over New York City, that God would send somebody to intervene in their lives, send somebody to be an advocate on their behalf, send somebody to be a mentor or a coach, or, just a friend. And why not me? Why not us? Right. But to know who those people are requires a sense of discernment. And so that's one of the ways that we stay focused. On the more practical, like day-to-day level, it means we walk into the school not as an expert who has everything figured out, but as a learner. We frame it often like we are treasure hunters. We're walking into a building with the conviction and the belief that no matter what the popular narrative is about this school or this neighborhood, there are students and teachers and administrators that are filling the hallways every day who've been fashioned in the image of God. It's not our job to give them value or to give them direction or purpose. It's our job to enhance and support and affirm the beauty that already exists. And when you take that posture, you're not going in there to point fingers and be the savior, but you're going in there with an open hand to serve and to give whatever we have to give to enhance the quality of this school experience for the kids. And that posture, I think, has kept the doors wide open. And it's hard. Honestly, it's not easy to work collaboratively with schools or teachers or churches or any group of people, but it's rewarding. And when you stick it out, it results in beautiful change.
That's the best. I I'm trying to imagine right now how different our nonprofits, our churches, our businesses, our homes would be if we took on the posture of being treasure hunters instead of saviors or fixers or, gift bringers, but knowing that like value and dignity and honor and wholeness is intrinsically embedded into every human, like that's a game changer. And it's a really beautiful picture that you just painted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think you're an urban nonprofit leader doing really valuable work in challenging spaces, and for a lot of listeners, in whatever role or context they find themselves in, they are leading from the fringe. They are some sort of minority voice. They carry a heavy load. They're helpers. They're activists. And so we, as a people, are known for getting stuff done. We know that we can accomplish tasks. That we can meet our goals. But I would love for you to talk with us about what does it look like for you to do the internal work so that you can sustain the external work, the pressures, the demands, the expectations, etc.
By internal work, you mean the personal internal work or the organizational internal work?
The personal, like how do you as a leader move towards health and wholeness and caring for yourself and paying attention to your RPMs and not burning out, all of those things as a leader, just you in yourself. How do you do that internal work?
So first off, I have to confess, there are seasons when I do it better than others, and there are seasons when I do it terribly badly. And so I think part of even maintaining any sense of perspective is to give a little grace that we're not always going to do it as well as we should. And in those moments, we need to lean into relationships with other people and fundamentally our relationship with God, to receive the grace and also receive the mercy that comes with our human tendency to overcommit and overextend and take on too much. So that's my initial disclaimer.
Thank you. That's important. Don't want to prop up an expectation or something here where it's like, that's an impossible thing to do. Let's give some people some easy yokes to take on. Yeah, so thank you.
Exactly. With that said, I think for me, one of the most important ways that I try to do it is leaning into community, giving a group of trusted friends explicit permission to call me out when I'm defaulting to all of my worst tendencies, to call me on the carpet, to encourage me if that's all I need, or to rebuke me if that's what I need. And I think, first of all, having the kind of trusted friends you can give that permission to takes quite a bit of work. It requires an intentionality and a life on life willingness to be vulnerable and to share experiences and the good, the bad, and the ugly. But as you commit to those kind of relationships, it becomes a buffer and a safety valve, at least for me. probably the most important thing. And then in addition,
Can I pause you for 1 second?
yeah, sure.
Because what you just expressed, like, I feel my heart's beating fast, because one of the like missions that I'm on these days, I've been in leadership roles for over 20 years now, so almost 40 years old, seen a lot of crap, seen a lot of leaders crash and burn, seen a lot of organizations fall apart because the leader and the leadership as a whole like haven't done the work internally, and so things just crumble. And one of the things that I hear over and over again is like, it's so lonely at the top. Like there's no one that gets me. I don't feel understood. I can't have connection with others because this role of a leader is so freaking hard. And so this mission that I'm on now is just to say that's a lie. I don't think that that has to be true in the way that we do life. And so hearing you talk about giving others explicit permission to speak into your life, to call out the best and the worst and challenge and encourage and rebuke and do all of it, I think that destroys this lie that leadership is lonely.
Yeah.
Do you agree? You want to change me on some of that stuff? Like, what do you think?
I agree. I would add that just because it's possible doesn't mean it's easy, and it does require intentionality, and I think a commitment. Like anything else that's worthwhile in life, you got to work at it. And relationships are difficult. There's going to be times when you're misunderstood, and times when you're offended, and times when your expectations weren't met, right? And just like any relationship that matters, being willing to extend grace and mercy, not just receive it, is really critical to the process. But when you commit to that, those relationships sustain us. There have been so many times in my life, including very recently, where I've needed somebody to kind of carry my burden. Maybe not in the literal sense, but like enough where I could unload it and know that they weren't going to violate that confidence and betray my trust. And just the act of sharing it and letting it out was like a pressure valve that was released, and I could keep on going. Those kind of things are for me super critical.
Yeah. So you're going to say another thing before I interrupted you. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, I think in addition to that, it's giving yourself permission to find and fuel the things that bring you joy. Right? So what is that? I say things, but usually it's not actually material objects. It's activities, it's creative outlets, it's relationships, it's adventure. And I think when we allow ourselves to recognize that that's part of who God made us to be, and it needs to be cultivated like everything else. It again gives us permission, but ultimately the payoff is a real sense of joy and exhaling and releasing. Sabbath is not an option; it's a commandment, and it's so easy as somebody who's wired to be a doer and to like take on the next challenge, to forget that Sabbath is not is not an option. And so the way that again, there have been times when I've been terrible at practicing what I preach, but the times when I do a better job of it, it's because Sabbath is life-giving. It allows me to cook, or it allows me to go on a hike, or it allows me to bring my boys on the ferry to the beach, or just do things that are out of the ordinary rhythm, that create memories and bring joy.
I love that. On the episode earlier this season with Nancy Ortberg, we were talking about self-leadership in that episode. And one of the things that she said was there was a study that was done in a partnership with a couple of different large organizations in the US. And one of the things that they found, actually the distinguishing factor around what will allow a leader to not burn out was not more education, not like better spiritual disciplines, but it was that leader had one hobby or something that was life-giving to them that they experienced for at least 1 hour every week where they lost time while doing it. And I love how that speaks to the way that we're designed, that we were created. We've been intended to lose time doing something that we absolutely love to do and has nothing to do with the work that we're doing, and how like disproportionately filling that is in your soul out of all the hours in the week, 167 hours in the week or something. And just at least 1 hour would be spent in that. It was really, that's shifting.
That's a beautiful way to think about it, actually. And I'm glad you threw that out there. I had never thought about it that way. But when you think about that statement in light of how God created, it wasn't until day 4 that he created the capacity to even tell time.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe the Genesis 1 account, the ability to tell time, to measure seasons, days, hours, weeks, doesn't exist until day 4. So he's lost in the time for the first 3 days in some really interesting way. And when you give, when those are the boundaries, you can get lost in creation. And in that process, I mean, we see in that story that at the end of day 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to the end, the common refrain was, "It is good."
Yes, totally.
Not "it is finished," but "it is good."
Oh my gosh.
The process is good, and the process will take as long as it takes. But engaging with that process is a good thing.
I love it. I want to go back to your confession earlier that sometimes you don't always get this doing the internal work right or well, or, to the extent that is required. And a few episodes ago in this season 2, Mindy Caliguire was talking about what does soul care look like, especially in relationship to, but different from self-care. And she said, we forget God and then we forget that we forgot, which is just like the human condition in so many ways, that forgetfulness is a part of, we don't do what it is that we know that we need to do. And we don't do what we should do. And, this ridiculous cycle that we can get into. I'm wondering if you could speak to when you forget to do the things that you know that you need to do, what does help trigger your memory? What helps you remember to jump back on track and to move forward doing the right things?
The beautiful thing about that question is, as I was responding with my initial answer, it occurred to me that in a question involving soul care, I never even referenced the creator of our soul, and the importance of spending time with him, meditating on the word, doing the spiritual disciplines, engaging with the rhythms of rest and the rhythms of meditation and prayer, that I think are the easiest for a type A, doer to overlook. And sometimes they're the hardest, and sometimes it's questions like the one you just asked that cause me to pause and say, wait a second, that's really the foundation. But then back to the relationships that are in my life that have been given permission. For me, like the self-reliant behaviors, those are a barometer of my spiritual condition a lot. Wow. And when I'm defaulting to working harder, or to staying at the office later, or to scheduling more meetings, right, or any of the tasks that might be associated with my job, a lot of times what that's really revealing is that I'm not taking time to rest. I'm not taking time, to pause and meditate and clear my head and and reflect on the promises of God and all of the things that I know over a lifetime of experience are really the foundation for impact. Um,
Mm.
and so questions like yours are a great trigger, as well as the relationships and things like that. And then honestly, when you're the more experienced you get in it, I think there's a level of conviction that comes when it's missing that you need to respond to. And, people know when they're not doing the right thing.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily need somebody to pull their card all the
Yeah.
time. But, so when we follow that instinct, it usually helps.
So, at the risk of putting you on the spot, but also humbly, boldly requesting some vulnerability, what are some warning signs for you that you're not doing the internal work, or that you're forgetting the most important stuff?
Um, so here's one that relates directly to something I said earlier, right? So the posture of service and the posture of
Mm.
treasure hunting,
Yeah.
um, that doesn't just happen, right? It's the byproduct of some intentionality. For me, when I'm not being intentional, now I'm speaking for me, not so much the
Yep.
organization, but the much more natural instinct for me is to be an arrogant know-it-all,
No.
that just
Yeah.
walks into a situation, kind of trusts his instinct, gets a quick,
Right.
synopsis and makes a whole bunch of judgments and
Yeah.
says, this is what we need to do.
Yeah.
When I'm not taking care of that inner life, that's one of the things that leaks
It's
and
really
comes
good.
back to the forefront. And it rubs people the wrong way. I can
Yeah.
come across as an arrogant pain and, bossy and authoritative and all of these things that fundamentally
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be, but they're
Mm-hmm.
part of my humanity that I have to
Mm-hmm.
keep in check. That's one example. There's a lot of other examples, but you just asked for one.
Taking me at my word right there. That's good. I also am finding it really encouraging and refreshing that the folks that have been on this season, particularly, there has been such a theme around relationship and of gathering people close, of kind of having Elle Campbell called it a girl gang. Um, but others have just talked about, like, what does it look like to have a cadre of people, like an inner circle, folks that know you and love you and value who you are more than what it is that you do, but also know that what you do is important because there's stuff that needs to happen in this world to make it a more whole place. So it just is really, as we're wrapping up this season right now, I'm thinking about what a beautiful thing that is, that some really phenomenal leaders on the fringe are going, you know what? Relationships, community, friendship are pretty critical
Yeah.
for us to be sustained for the long haul and to be the kinds of leaders that are worth following, because we're the kinds of people that are increasingly healthy and whole. So thanks for punctuating that.
Well, I think there's at least two reasons for that. I mean, there's probably a number of reasons for that, but two of the common ones. Number one, when people really are pursuing God, it's impossible to pursue a trusting, faithful, loving relationship with a God you cannot see if you're not in trusting, loving relationships with brothers
Yeah.
and sisters you can see. I mean, that's a biblical principle. And I think for people that are really trying to be faithful to the scripture, there that's part of it. So if you're committed to those kind of relationships, the value of the
Mm.
relationships becomes self-evident, and we can't live without them, right? Another thing I think that's probably at play, given who you invite onto the podcast, when people are marginalized and
Mm.
vulnerable by definition, we need each other more. There's no pretense of self-reliance when our existence is interdependent with others and their flourishing, right? And so when you're talking and engaging people who've been set aside, whether by circumstance or injustice or whatever their backstory is, when people are in a sense of desperation or a sense of just the struggle, we get through the struggle because other people help us get through the struggle. And so I think it's more than just this theological idea for people who are on the fringes. It's a very, very much part of our survival and our thriving is to have those relationships around us.
I don't know that I've ever heard it articulated as clearly and beautifully and powerfully as what you just said. And that resonates like in my core, that like self-reliance and this independent, pull me up by my bootstraps, work it all out by myself, conquer the world, self-made man or woman, like all of that is BS. And yeah, when you are experiencing some marginalization or oppression, uh, yeah, we need each other. And it's implicitly felt. Oh my gosh. Wow. I'm going to chew on that for a bit. Okay. So this is a good place to start wrapping up. I would love to keep talking with you, and I'm sure people are wishing we would continue the conversation, but we're going to wrap it up. And I've been closing this season with 3 questions that help for people to create their own map of sorts for how they define, design, and do their life to get from where they are to where they want to be. Because, I mean, you and I know it's not a linear process. It's not A plus B equals C. It's not, a rock solid plan, but like you can create a map, and figure out a variety of ways to get to where it is that you want to go. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions around define, design, and do. And I need your quick, like 60 seconds or less, gut responses to each of those questions. Got it?
Got it.
All right. So in this define area, how do you, Jeremy Del Rio, give yourself a reality check?
I think one of the ways we've been talking about now, which is relying on people that can see my blind spots better than I can. And as they have that explicit permission to call me out, that becomes the ultimate reality check because it's unfiltered. It doesn't have any of my biases or my tendency to forgive myself a lot quicker than I forgive others. So that's probably the most important part for me.
Yeah. So many folks have said a version of that exact same thing. And I love the different ways that it's being expressed. So, okay. So design, what is a practice you do intentionally so you are proactive with your life?
Regular evaluation helps me. There are 4 helpful questions that I was introduced to many years ago that we've incorporated into our work practices, but also into my personal life. And those are what's right, what's wrong, what's confused, and what's missing. And being able to answer those questions honestly and non-judgmentally gives perspective and a starting point for any design process.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. Last question. We've been talking all conversation about doing the work, but what's a 1-degree trajectory shift that you have made that has changed everything for you over the years? So something small that you didn't think would be a important shift or decision, but it has really changed the trajectory of your life.
Again, I don't always do this as well as I'd like, but when you trusting your gut and taking action quickly, right? So if you're in a situation and you're impressed to respond to the homeless person on the side of the street, respond to the homeless person on the side of the street. Don't wait and hope that he'll be there when you return. That kind of instinct, kind of going, I think recognizing that those instincts are God-given.
Yeah.
And if you're feeling it or sensing it in that moment, it's usually for a reason. And so stay present in the moment and respond as much as possible in that moment.
Well, my friend, you have been even more brilliant and more helpful than I was hoping. And I had pretty good expectations for our conversation. I'm really grateful for you. And I've seen up close and also from a distance your humility, your power, your honesty, your courage. And I am profoundly grateful that God's picked you to launch this incredible organization, to make a difference in New York City. To impact lives that you will never know the full extent of your service and of your leadership. So thank you for contributing to this conversation. I know you are bonkers busy right now. And so for you to say yes to this 47-minute conversation is very meaningful. And if I can ever, return the favor or give a gift in that way, I would love to. So I would like for you to tell people two things as we're wrapping up now. How can people find you online? And if they're listening and they're going, I need to respond quickly and support the work that Jeremy is doing at Thrive Collective, how do they do that? So how do they find you and how can they support the work that you're up to?
Well, to support Thrive Collective, visit thrivecollective.org and you can make a donation, or if you live in New York, you can volunteer on one of our projects, or even beyond that. So there's lots of different ways to dial in, and the website can help to direct you. In terms of finding me, I'm pretty active on social media as well as on the website and things like that. So Jeremy R. Del Rio is my Instagram, and Jeremy Del Rio is everything else on social media. And would love to stay connected.
Awesome. Well, we will link this to the show notes so people can easily find you and follow and contribute. So thank you again so much. Super honored to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a blast.
Next time.
Hey friends, do you love podcasts like the one you just listened to? Have you ever dreamed about having your own? Well, my name is Michael and I work for TruthWork Media. We believe that everyone has a story and every story deserves a podcast. Let us help you get started. Look us up at www.truthworkmedia.com, fill out our questionnaire, and I'll schedule a time to talk. It's really that easy. TruthWork Media. Everyone has a story. Yours needs a podcast.